Hi, my name is Mr. Smith. Welcome to Honors Government and Economics. This is the first lecture for the first unit about creating America. This will give us a basic introduction, but also covers some of the preview material for the other units that will follow. First of all, a lot of people ask themselves, what is government? A lot of people think it's about power. A lot of people think it's about control. Some people think it's about helping others. And whenever we ask this question, we also have to determine how exactly we should govern, because answering that question kind of helps determine what the answer to the first one is. And then, of course, what should government do? And there are many things that people could agree upon, for instance, keeping law and order and providing for national defense. But other ones, though, there's quite a bit of disagreement about. Providing public goods and services is a little dicey because whether or not it's a necessity is a question. One thing that many experts agree upon is when there is a failure in the marketplace, when businesses can't provide something, the government should step in instead. Or if the marketplace has negative side effects or negative externalities, the government should step in and provide some type of programming or regulations. Preserving order really isn't something that there's a lot of disagreement about, but how it's done can cause some disagreement. And then, of course, socializing of the young, that can be controversial because the question is, how are we educating the youth? How are we providing them with schools, and what is going on within those school systems? Do families have to choose the same type of education, or do they have a choice? These are all questions that go along with socializing the young. And then, of course, most controversial of all in America is collection of taxes. We have a variety of taxes for all three levels of governments. They're not the same in each of the 50 states. And obviously, that's taking people's money. And when that goes toward a program that they don't agree with, it makes them even angrier about taxes. So, all of these topics, to varying degrees, can have disagreements about them, some more than others. In the United States of America, though, despite the fact that there are controversies, despite the fact that there are two major parties that are often at odds with each other, we generally respect the transfer of power. So when there is an election, when the people do make a choice, they're willing to give power over to another. Here, for instance, is the first female Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. After she lost her majority and her first speakership, she's handing the gavel of the House over to new Speaker John Boehner. He, of course, has since retired, and Nancy Pelosi later on returned to the speakership. So that just shows you it can go back and forth. Looking at national defense, of course, one of the more controversial aspects of it today would be our long-term wars, especially in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where we keep troops for 10, 20 years. It's always been controversial when we try to help rebuild a country after we have been involved in a conflict with it. And so this also brings up a lot of disagreements. Here you see a question: which of the following is not a duty of government? Collecting taxes, providing for national defense, promoting religion, and preserving order. Which one of these things is not a responsibility in the United States? Well, that would be promoting religion. In the First Amendment, Congress can't establish a church or stop people from freely exercising their religion. And so that means the federal government, and because of the 14th Amendment, which says that all the other governments, like state and local, have to follow the Bill of Rights, it means that no government can establish or promote a religion. What is politics? So basically, politics involves the process of controlling the policy agenda. What kind of programming are we going to come up with? Well, that is determined by who is in charge, which is then, before that, determined by elections. And however elections are won is determined by who is politically participating. And so that's more than just voting. It also includes things like campaigning. It includes raising money. It includes distributing materials like various types of propaganda. All of this is part of the political participation. Here you can see political participation in a negative sense when it comes to apathy, those that have negative or the feeling that they can't make a difference. You can see the green line is for 18 through 29-year-olds, and the apathy among them is incredibly high. It's over 50%. Around 2000, it was almost reaching 70%. And so it's incredibly high. For those that are older, 65 and more, they, of course, have a much better reflection on political participation and governance. And so you can see their apathy levels are a little bit lower, always being below 40%. You can see there in 2004, it was dropping down almost to 10%. So usually their participation rates are higher. And perhaps that's why programs for the elderly like Medicare and Social Security are much more valued and protected in the United States. And here we have another one about political knowledge. Despite the use of internet and social media, even by the year 2008, you can see that knowledge of age groups, of course, differs quite a bit as well. Under the age of 30, 1972, a lot more knowledge. 2008, a lot more formats to getting information, yet for that age group, the knowledge is still lower. In fact, it's dropped. You would think it would be the opposite. You think that social media and the internet would allow younger people to have more exposure to correct information about governance, but that hasn't been the case. Then you can see the elderly, both in 1972 and in 2008, they had over 40% correct political knowledge to various questions. And so that shows that the older that we get, the more we pay attention in particular. But notice something else, that from the 1972 numbers to the 2008 numbers, in each case it dropped. So that's a little bit disconcerting, because once again, there's more information out there. Shouldn't people know more? And here are election turnout rates for younger and older Americans over 65. You can see it's much higher, often being above 60%. And then for people between 18 and 24, it's much lower, almost all the time below 50%. You can see those peaks when it goes up and down. The higher numbers are usually during election years. You can see 2008 for both the young and the old, the numbers were higher. In 2006 were congressional and state elections, like for governor. People put less focus on those. And so the participation rates in non-leap years, non-presidential election years, tends to be lower. Then, of course, there's politics. Some issues make a lot bigger deal than others. Abortion, in particular, gets a lot of attention, even though it's just one issue. And of course, some people vote just based on that one issue. And so that can obviously be very polarizing and catch the attention of the rest of the public, even if they're not necessarily concerned about those particular issues. When it comes to abortion rallies, you see lots of massive people who are hotly contesting both sides of the issue, but they're actually a small portion of the population. But once again, they absorb a lot of the attention, which is true of single issue groups. And just like I said, they vote for politicians who just support their issue. So they might disagree with everything else that politician says, but they're just going to vote for them because of this one particular political topic. But even if you're not a member of a single issue party or single issue group or concern or interest group, as it's called, people still end up making a difference. People help shape policy, even with something as simple as voting, because they're getting certain candidates in there that will make certain type of policies, but also in a variety of other ways, through lobbying, like I said before, through donating, through volunteering, and so on. So the political impact of people can be strong, not just in election years, especially if elected officials feel like there's a lot of pressure on them. The policymaking system, as you can see here, starts off with the average person and the interest they have. What is their public interest? What are the problems that they are concerned about? Then, of course, they link up with various groups. The political parties have certain messaging that they try to reach out and grab a hold of people's attention. People get excited around elections because it's their time to make a difference. And obviously, the media concentrates on certain things. If there's a lot of news stories about the environment, that's going to catch people's attention a lot more than other issues. And then, of course, there are interest groups. These are non party organizations that represent particular issues. The National Rifle Association is the example of an interest group. The Sierra Club is an interest group for the environment. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, is an organization that represents that one particular concern. All of these, of course, then put pressure on policy agenda, on some type of topics to be brought up more often than others and to possibly get the attention of the government, particularly through elected officials. And so then we move on to the policymaking institutions. Congress and the state legislatures have the most say in developing policy. And so they take the lead, but obviously the executives, like governors and presidents, can sign or veto laws. And then, of course, courts can rule certain laws or plans or programs unconstitutional according to the federal or state constitutions. And then it's up to the executive branch once again to implement that policy. If environmental law is passed by Congress and signed by the president, then it's up to the Environmental Protection Agency, part of the executive branch, part of the civil service or bureaucracy, in order to enforce those environmental laws. And then, of course, there's the actual policy once it starts to actually take place, implemented by those executive branch departments. That includes, of course, where they're going to get their budget from, what taxes are needed for it, what types of laws are necessarily implied, because maybe one law was passed here, but that overrules another, or maybe it's redundant, or maybe it couples with another from a different agency. That can be very complicated. And then, of course, often laws can't anticipate every single thing that's going to come up. If we pass a law, for instance, against a particular type of pollution involving coastal areas because of climate change, we can't possibly anticipate every single problem that might occur because of rising waters in those coastal areas. And so laws are often written vaguely by Congress or the state legislatures. So then the bureaucracy has to then fill in the blanks with making regulations to meet those specific modifications. And then, of course, sometimes they can't do that. And so when that happens, then there's no decision at all. And that just results either in a problem that gets ignored or something that comes to the front burner again because it's a problem. And then, of course, all of this impacts the people. We have to live with these regulations. We have to live with these taxes. We have to live with the fact that this budget went here instead of there. All of that, of course, is part of a giant cycle. So I really talked about all of these already. Linkage institutions, the policy agenda, the political issues, and the policy-making institutions. Once again, I would want to emphasize that the state legislature and the Congress, the legislative bodies, have the most impact because they're the ones that create programs. We give all kinds of attention, negative and positive, to presidents for programming, but it's really Congress. The New Deal was because of Congress, not necessarily FDR. A lot of the changes that Reagan made, especially in reference to economics, happened because of Congress, which at the time when he first began was controlled by the Democratic Party. So the legislature is the one who has the greatest policymaking, institutional enforcement or change or push. And then, of course, public policy, a term that I didn't go over too much already, was statute. That is in reference to a legislative law that is passed. That's different than than a constitutional law. Those take place directly in the Constitution. A statute is a law passed by the legislature. And so we hear about something called statutory something. That is because it was developed by the legislative branch. Presidential action can include things like executive orders to get things done and to implement public policy. Court decisions, of course, can not only avoid certain laws or programs, but they might ask to modify them to better fit with the Constitution, or maybe some type of confusion involving lawsuits from not students, but the people. And then budgetary choices. Once again, programs, to varying degrees, how much they can or cannot happen depends upon how much money is available for them. And once again, regulation is created by those executive agencies to clarify vague laws. Policies should be effective. They should make a difference. They should address the problem that was brought up in the first place. And they must have a goal to end X or to solve Y. Those should be the goals that take place. But often people just want something because it's exciting. People want something because it's politically positive. Elected officials know they'll get lots of votes. Unfortunately, both people and elected officials don't always ask, will this program be effective and does it have a goal? And there you can see a brief description. Congressional statutes are those passed by law. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was to help out after the Great Recession that started underneath President George W. Bush and continued under the early years of President Obama. Presidential decision, for instance, their action, especially as strong as commander in chief, for instance, sending troops into a country, they have to eventually receive congressional approval. And then, of course, withdrawing them isn't as complex. A court decision, for instance, an opinion by the Supreme Court or other court like the state Supreme Courts, can rule certain things are constitutional or unconstitutional. Many cities, for instance, had laws against handguns. That was thrown out by the Supreme Court because we have a right to bear arms and own a gun. Budgetary choices, once again, legislatures have to choose between taxes, taking money in, and expenditures, which is putting money out. And that is done on a regular basis with both the federal budgets and state budgets. And then regulation. This is when, of course, an agency or department of the federal or state governments tries to clarify vague laws and policy by writing regulations to clarify. The Department of Education issues guidelines for qualifying for the federal student loan program, for instance, the forgiveness program. So they stipulate exactly how that's going to be done. The state legislature passes laws about COVID in schools, but obviously they can't participate in everything. For instance, from Harrisburg, the General Assembly, our state legislature, they can't possibly anticipate everything that all 500 school districts are going to go through. So it's up to the Department of Education at the state level to clarify that. So reasons that we have or why we give into the public policy, which of the following is an example of public policy? Congressional statute. Religious edict, that's not part of the government. Parental rule, not part of the government. Personal conviction, that's good when people have those. But once again, we're only talking about programming that's been passed by the legislative branch. Democracy in America. Here are some items that we'll talk about. Traditional democratic theory, 3 contemporary theories of American democracy, challenges to democracy, American political culture, and democracy. And of course, what a common phrase that's often used in the news would be culture war. Key principles of the American democratic process. First of all, equality in voting. And this is something we've strived for over the years, obviously, in the beginning of our history, especially in the colonial era, but also even just after we achieved independence, there were many restrictions. White men who own property or pay taxes could vote. Eventually, those restrictions were gotten rid of. Then eventually, African American men were allowed to vote, starting with the 13th Amendment. Then the 19th Amendment allowed women, for instance. And then the 26th Amendment allowed people between the ages of 18 and 21 to vote, which they hadn't been allowed to before. So it has been a long process in going forward. Of course, some people say people between the ages of 16 and 17 pay taxes. Should they be able to vote? They ask that question. Some people point out the fact that legal immigrants, for instance, work and pay taxes, and so should they be allowed to have a vote? And of course, there are those that disagree with that. Effective participation. How well are people participating? How well are they being engaged? Enlightened understanding. Of course, we get a lot of information from school and from the news, but the question is what quality does it have? And then how much control do we have as citizens over the agenda? Obviously, with elections, it makes that a little bit easier. But even though we have more elections than just about any other place on the face of the earth, they only happen every once in a while. So even for federal government, they only happen every 2 years at the most. For state governments, once every 2 years. For local governments, once every 2 years. And so we go quite a period of time. Now, of course, we rotate those. Those all don't take place at the same time, which is why we have elections every year. But still, for specific groups of elected officials, even though we do have control over them through elections, there is a time period that goes by between those choices. And then, of course, inclusion. How much are people made a part of a society? How much assimilation happens so that people become citizens? Not just those coming here from other countries, but also the people that are coming of age, how much are they included? And then, of course, we do have majority rule. We get that from the time of the Mayflower Compact at Plymouth. When the Pilgrims arrived, of course, it had been a rough journey. Massachusetts was not where they had planned to arrive. They were supposed to go to Virginia. And of course, Massachusetts, not always the most hospitable of climates. So they had to make a decision: should we stay or should we go back to Europe? And they took a vote and they decided to go with whatever the majority wanted. But even though we follow that today, the majority rule, we still have to respect that the majority can't simply crush the minority, that the minority does have rights. And of course, once again, even though we actually say we live in a democracy, technically it's not 100% a democracy, at least not direct democracy. It's a representative democracy, or in other words, called a republic. And that's why it's maybe a little bit more right to refer to ourselves as a republic than a democracy. First of all, there are three contemporary theories of American democracy: pluralism, which is that groups of minorities work together throughout the country in order to create public policy. Elitism says that power is held by wealthy groups and that they control the agenda and look out for themselves. And then hyperpluralism says that there's so many groups and so many opinions that they possibly can't get that much done because there's just too much opinion making that goes on. Challenges to democracy: increasingly complex issues. With technology, for instance, all kinds of impacts on privacy that we haven't even begun to start to solve. As technology improves, what happens when we do eventually develop flying cars, when we're able to manipulate gravity or space travel is made more advantageous? Obviously, as issues go forward, especially with technology, they become more complex. And so that is a problem for the average person. Can the average person have a full understanding? Could they actually take a vote on whether or not we should withdraw troops from Afghanistan, for instance? Limited participation in government. People do get involved, but as you saw by those numbers earlier, voting participation rates are not 100%. And it'd be great not only if those people participated, but they got involved in campaigns in their political party and donated money and volunteered time. But not a lot of people do that. Diverse political interest. When there are so many different opinions and you have a country that's so big like the United States of America, obviously because of that possible hyperpluralism, you end up having policy gridlock. And that's especially true at times in the United States Congress. Right now we have a Democratic, for instance, in the year 2020, a Democratic House of Representatives and a Republican Senate. The Democratic House has passed bills that the Republican Senate won't pass, and vice versa. And so that becomes a problem. Escalating campaign costs because of the media, because of TV and social media costs for advertising. We're now spending billions of dollars each time there is, especially something like a presidential election. So that's a little bit of a problem as well, because a lot of people are turned off by that. A lot of people are turned off by the fact that so much money is spent on campaigns. There are, of course, organizations that are allowed to exist, super PACs or political action committees that gather money for special interests, and you can donate lots of money to that, and they can then in turn donate lots of money to help support candidates. They can't work directly with campaigns, for instance, but they can run their own ads, they can create their own materials and propaganda. And so it's not always transparent exactly who's involved with these organizations, and so that troubles some Americans. Political culture in the United States is based on some of these variables. One, the idea of liberty, the fact that we are not controlled by tyrants, that we have the freedom to do what we want. We also believe in egalitarianism in the United States. Individualism, the fact that people can make their own choices. Laissez-faire, which means that we believe in the free marketplace, that we can go out and start our own businesses and sell and buy our own products. And then populism, the fact that the masses can have some sort of sway and influence over everything else. Some of these, of course, conflict with each other. Egalitarianism is about equality, but individualism and laissez-faire means that if you want to start your own businesses and go out and get your own job and other things, you can sometimes fail. And so some people are going to become more successful than others, and they're going to perhaps give more favors and money to their own offspring. And so some people look at that as non egalitarian. Others say that it's completely okay because as long as we have the same rights like freedom of speech and the ability to vote, then therefore that is enough for egalitarianism. So that is a little bit complicated. And here, of course, is an emphasis of that liberty in New Hampshire. License plate, live free or die is their motto. Political culture based on the American creed, if we keep moving forward here. Pride and equal treatment of groups in the United States and other established democracies. You can see we have a very high rating of that. Canada's a little bit more. They also have a history of immigration, for instance. Culture war, polarization of liberal and conservative political culture. Is this happening? Many people would say yes, because people are shutting down, listening to the other side. Cancel culture is a part of this. Making a big deal about other things that happen on the opposite side of the political spectrum is like that. Someone says something controversial racially, and should they be shut down completely? Should they be fired from their jobs? Many people on the left would say yes. Many people on the right don't, even though they say they like businesses to make their own decisions. When Starbucks got rid of winter images, snowflakes, and trees on their cups during the winter season, many conservatives were outraged at this because it was an attack on Christianity, even though none of the symbols had anything to do with Christmas. So both sides get really ramped up and make a big deal about things that maybe only a small segment of the opposite side actually cares about. And so this has been ratcheting up because of things like social media as well. And of course, loss of traditional values causes people to change their perspectives. And with growth comes pain. So whether or not rejecting traditional values is good or bad, it still does lead to change. And whenever you have change, you have adjustments in public policy, adjustments in law. And also the idea of patriotism. And this is where both sides differ as well. It's probably necessary to have pride in both the symbolism of your country and the values of your country. But both sides concentrate on the opposite of each other. So people on the right tend to concentrate more on symbolism, people on the left concentrate more on values. And that often causes a conflict because both sides think they're disrespecting each other's form of patriotism and what this country stands for. And so that can cause irreconcilable differences when people get angry and accuse each other of hating America or not wanting to succeed, not wanting it to succeed. That can cause some differences that just possibly can't be repaired. Which of the following illustrates hyperpluralism? The use of the court system to try to set policy, because if you have so many groups, they're obviously going to have to rely on some kind of arbiter in order to come up with a solution for their problems. And so the use of the court system to try to set policy is the answer there. How active is the American government? Well, we have a lot of different programs for a lot of different things. Here's a picture of women, infant, and children funds that are going out to individuals, particularly women who are pregnant or with a young child. They can get money for certain types of food. So that's just one program. There are many different programs to help those that are impoverished. There are many different programs to help businesses. There are many different programs from the federal government to help the state and local governments. There are many different programs to help the environment, and so on. So there's a large and active amount of public policy that's occurring. The gross domestic product, or GDP, is the total value of what is produced in the United States a year. The government spends about 1/3 of the total money of the value of what we produce in the year. And the government also employs 24 million people, which is a higher population than most of the states, individual states. Americans expect the government to solve problems, though. So even people that complain about government will want it to solve problems: unemployment, terrorism, illegal immigration, energy, education, lack of access to health care. lack of proper technology. For instance, high-speed internet. I once went to a town hall to listen to a state representative, and many people there, you could tell from the way they reacted to his speech, that they were more conservative in nature, that they expected small government and less regulation and less money spent by the government. But when the question and answer session opened up, they said, when's the government going to do something about getting high speed internet? So even though they were opposed to government involvement and spending money and so on, they still wanted the government to solve a problem that they had. So about 1/3 of the GDP is spent by the different levels of government: federal, state, and local. Now, some local governments only, like rural townships, which are one of the smallest and least populated levels of government, they might only spend tens of thousands of dollars a year. But some bigger cities can have budgets worth billions of dollars. And so it all adds up. So all three levels of government combined. And so, what are the theories of policymaking in the United States? Which theory seems most plausible to you? So, which one of them? Do you think it's elite theory? Do you think it's hyperpluralism? Do you think it's pluralism? How do you think our democracy operates in respect to those theories? So, that's something to think about as we move forward.